This book affirms the reality of spirit and the reality of matter, and tries to determine the relation of the one to the other by the study of a definite example, that of memory. Matter, in our view, is an aggregate of images, and by image we mean a certain existence which is more than that which the idealist calls a representation, but less than that which the realist calls a thing. An existence placed halfway between. My body is, in the aggregate of the material world, an image which acts like other images, receiving and giving back movement. And perhaps, with this difference only, that my body appears to choose, within certain limits, the manner in which it shall restore what it receives. In our opinion, the brain is no more than a central telephonic exchange. Its office is to allow communication or to delay it. The nervous system is in no sense an apparatus which may serve to fabricate or even to prepare representation. Its function is to receive stimulation. The degree of independence of which a living being is master, or as we shall say, the zone of indetermination, which surrounds its activity, allows then of an a priori estimate of the number and the distance of the things with which it is in relation. Whatever this relation may be, whatever be the inner nature of perception, we can affirm that its amplitude gives the exact measure of the indetermination of the act which is to follow, so that we can formulate this law. Perception is master of space, in the exact measure in which action is master of time. There is no perception which is not full of memories. In most cases, these memories supplant our actual perceptions. However brief we suppose any perception to be, it always occupies a certain duration. Memory in these two forms, covering as it does with a cloak of recollections, a core of immediate perception, and also contracting a number of external moments into a single internal moment, constitutes the principal share of individual consciousness and perception. Pure perception, by giving up every form of memory, of obtaining a vision of matter both immediate and instantaneous. A representation of matter is the measure of our possible action upon bodies. It results from the discarding of what has no interest for our needs, or more generally for our functions. In one sense, we might say that the perception of any unconscious material point whatever, in its instantaneousness, is infinitely greater and more complete than ours, since this point gathers and transmits the influences of all the points of the material universe, whereas our consciousness only attains to certain parts and certain aspects of those parts. Perception, understood as we understand it, measures our possible action upon things, and thereby inversely the possible action of things upon us. The greater the body's power of action, symbolized by a higher degree of complexity in the nervous system, the wider is the field that perception embraces. Our sensations are then to our perceptions that which the real action of our body is to its possible or virtual action. Its virtual action concerns other objects and is manifested within those objects. Its real action concerns itself and is manifested within its own substance. My perception is outside my body and my affection within it. Affection is not the primary material of which perception is made, it is rather the impurity with which perception is alloyed. There is, in the aggregate of images, a privileged image, perceived in the depths, and no longer only on the surface, the seat of affection, and at the same time the source of action. It is this particular image which I adopt as the center of my universe, and as the physical basis of my personality. Our perceptions are undoubtedly interlaced with memories, and inversely, a memory only becomes actual by borrowing the body of some perception into which it slips. These two acts, perception and recollection, always interpenetrate each other, always exchanging some of their substance. The actuality of our perception lies in its activity, in the movements which prolong it, and not in its greater intensity. The past is only an idea. The present is ideomotor. Restore, on the contrary, the true character of perception. Recognize in pure perception a system of nascent acts, which plunges roots deep into the real, and at once perception is seen to be radically distinct from recollection. The reality of things is no more constructed or reconstructed, but touched, penetrated, lived, and the problem at issue between realism and idealism is dissolved by intuition. Pure perception occupies a certain depth of duration, so that our successive, if we were to eliminate all memory, we should pass thereby from perception to matter, from the subject to the object. Questions relating to subject and object and their distinction and their union should be put in terms of time rather than space. Two kinds of memory. The first records in the form of memory images all the events of our daily life as they occur in time, and a memory profoundly different from the first, always bent upon action, seated in the present and looking only to the future. One imagines and the other repeats. To call up the past in the form of an image, we must be able to withdraw ourselves from the action of the moment. We must have the power to value the useless. We must have the will to dream. Of these two memories that we have distinguished, the second, which is active or motor, will then constantly inhibit the first, or at least only accept from it that which can throw light upon and complete in a useful way the present situation. But besides the services which they can render by associating with the present perception, the images stored up in the spontaneous memory have yet another use. No doubt they are dream images. No doubt they usually appear and disappear independently of our will. This is why when we really wish to know something, we are obliged to learn it by heart, that is to say, by substituting for this spontaneous image a motor mechanism. Kinds of recognition. Automatic recognition, which is mainly achieved through movements, that which requires the regular intervention of memory images. The first is recognition by inattention. The second is attentive recognition. Memory creates anew the present perception. We maintain that reflective perception is a circuit in which all the elements, including the perceived object itself, hold each other in a state of mutual tension, as in an electric circuit, so that no disturbance starting from the object can stop on its way and remain in the depths of the mind. It must always find its way back to the object from where it proceeds. After having rebuilt the object perceived as an independent whole, we reassemble, together with it, the more and more distinct conditions with which it forms one system. If we call the derivatives of B, C, and D these causes of growing depth, situated behind the object and virtually given with the object itself, it will be seen that the progress of attention results in creating anew not only the object perceived, but also the ever-widening systems with which it may be bound up, so that in the measure in which the circles B, C, D represent a higher expansion of memory, their reflection attains in their derivatives deeper strata of reality. The same psychical life, therefore, must be supposed to be repeated an endless number of times in the different stories of memory. And the same act of the mind may be performed at varying heights. But what would be the use of repeating a habit if the result were always to reproduce the same thing? The true effect of repetition is to decompose and then to recompose. We have said that attentive recognition is a kind of circuit in which the external objects yield to us deeper and deeper parts of itself, as our memory adopts a correspondingly higher degree of tension in order to project recollections towards it. The hearer places herself at once in the midst of the corresponding ideas, and then develops them into acoustic memories. To understand another's words is to reconstruct intelligently, starting from the ideas, the continuity of sound, which the ear perceives, and more generally to attend, to recognize, intellectually to interpret, may be summed up in a single operation whereby the mind, having chosen its level, having selected within itself with reference to the crude perceptions the point that is exactly symmetrical with their more or less immediate cause, allows them to flow toward them the memories that will go out to overlie them. Essentially discontinuous, since it proceeds by juxtaposing words, speech can only indicate by a few guideposts placed here and there the chief stages and the movements of thought. There cannot be in the brain a region in which memories congeal and accumulate. Complete perception is only defined and distinguished by its coalescence with the memory image, which we send forth to meet it. Virtual, this memory can only become actual by means of the perception which attracts it. Powerless, it borrows life and strength from the present sensation in which it is materialized. Does this not amount to saying that distinct perception is brought about by two opposite currents, of which the one centripetal comes from the external object and the other centrifugal has for its point of departure that which we term pure memory? The first current alone would only give a passive perception which the mechanical reactions which accompany it. The second, left to itself, tends to give a recollection that is actualized, more and more actual, as the current becomes more marked. Together, these two currents make up at their point of confluence the perception that is distinct and recognized. The centers in which the elementary sensations seem to originate may be actuated in some way from two different sides, from the front and from behind. From the front, they receive impressions sent in by the sense organs, and consequently by a real object. From behind, they are subject, through successive intermediaries, to the influence of a virtual object. The centers of images, if these exist, can only be the organs that are exactly symmetrical with the organs of the senses in reference to the sensory centers. They are no more the depositories of pure memories, that is, of virtual objects, than the organs of the senses are depositories of real objects. We do not go from the perception to the idea, but from the idea to the perception. The essential process of recognition is not centripetal, but centrifugal. Pure memories, as they become actual, tend to bring about within the body all the corresponding sensations. But these virtual sensations themselves, in order to become real, must tend to urge the body to action and to impress upon it those movements and attitudes of which they are the habitual antecedent. To sum up briefly the preceding chapters, perception is never a mere contact of the mind With the object present, it is impregnated with memory images, which complete it as they interpret it. The memory image in its turn partakes of the pure memory, which it begins to materialize, and of the perception in which it tends to embody itself. Regarded from the latter point of view, it might be defined as a nascent perception. Lastly, pure memory, though independent in theory, manifests itself as a rule only in the colored and living image which reveals it. Whenever we are trying to recover a recollection, to call up some period of our history, we become conscious of an act sui generis by which we detach ourselves from the present in order to replace ourselves first in the past in general, then in a certain region of the past, a work of adjustment, something like the focusing of a camera, but our recollection still remains virtual. We simply prepare ourselves to receive it by adopting the appropriate attitude. Little by little, it comes into view like a condensing cloud. From the virtual state, it passes into the actual, and as its outlines become more distinct and its surface takes on color, it tends to imitate perception. But it remains attached to the past by its deepest roots, and if one once realized it did not retain something of its original virtuality, if, being a present state, it were not also something which stands out distinct from the present, we should never know it for memory. To picture is not to remember. The adherence of this memory to our present condition is exactly comparable to the adherence of unperceived objects to those objects which we perceive. The unconscious plays in each case a similar part. The extraordinary development of spontaneous memory in most children is due to the fact that they have not yet persuaded their memory to remain bound up with their conduct. The apparent diminution of memory as intellect develops is then due to the growing organization of recollections with acts. It would seem then that we start neither from the perception of the individual nor from the conception of the genus, but from an intermediate knowledge, from a confused sense of the striking quality, or of resemblance. Memory grafting distinctions upon resemblances which have been spontaneously abstracted, the understanding disengaging from the habit of resemblances, the clear idea of generality. This idea of generality was, in the beginning, only our consciousness of a likeness of attitude in a diversity of situations. It was habit itself. It is enough to say that the understanding imitating the effort of nature has also set up motor apparatuses, artificial in this case, to make a limited number of them answer to an unlimited number of individual objects. The assemblage of these mechanisms is articulate speech. The essence of the general idea is to be unceasingly going backwards and forwards between the plane of action and that of pure memory. The general idea escapes us as soon as we try to fix it at either of the two extremities. It consists in the double current which goes from the one to the other, always ready either to crystallize into uttered words or to evaporate into memories. Normal self never stays in either of these extreme positions, it moves between them. However profound are the differences which separate two images, we shall always find, if we go back high enough, a common genus to which they belong, and consequently a resemblance which may serve as connecting link between them. Memory, laden with the whole of the past, responds to the appeal of the present state by two simultaneous movements, one of translation, by which it moves in its entirety to meet experience, this contracting more or less, though without dividing, with a view to action, and the other of rotation upon itself, by which it turns toward the situation of the moment, presenting to it that side of itself which may prove to be the most useful. They answer to different mental dispositions, to two distinct degrees of tension of the memory. In the latter case, they are nearer to the pure image. In the former, they are more disposed toward immediate response, to action. Memory has its successive and distinct degrees of tension or of vitality. Just as there are different planes, infinite in number, for association by similarity, so there are with association by contiguity. Every association by contiguity implies a position of the mind intermediate between the two extreme limits. The work of localization consists in reality in a growing effort of expansion, by which the memory, always present in its entirety to itself, spreads out its recollections over an ever wider surface, and so ends by distinguishing in what was till then a confused mass, the remembrance which could not find its proper place. In retrogressive amnesia, the recollections which disappear from consciousness are probably preserved in remote planes of memory. One general conclusion follows from the first 3 chapters of this book. It is that the body, always turned towards action, has for its essential function to limit, with a view to action, the life of the spirit. In regard to representations, it is an instrument of choice, and of choice alone. It can neither beget nor cause an intellectual state. Consider perception to begin with. The body, by the place which at each moment it occupies in the universe, indicates the parts and the aspects of matter on which we can lay hold. Our perception, which exactly measures our virtual action on things, thus limits itself to the objects which actually influence our organs and prepare our movements. Now let us turn to memory. The function of the body is not to store up recollections, but simply to choose in order to bring back to distinct consciousness, by the real efficacy thus conferred on it, the useful memory, that which may complete and illuminate the present situation, with a view to ultimate action. That which is commonly called a fact is not reality as it appears to immediate intuition, but an adaptation of the real to the interests of praxis and the exigencies of social life. Pure intuition, external or internal, is that of an undivided continuity. A third course lay open. This is to replace ourselves in pure duration, of which the flow is continuous, and in which we pass insensibly from one state to another, a continuity which is really lived, but artificially decomposed for the greater convenience of customary knowledge. In the human, the thinking being, the free act may be termed a synthesis of feelings and ideas, and the evolution which leads to it a reasonable evolution. The artifice of this method simply consists, in short, in distinguishing the point of view of customary or useful knowledge from that of true knowledge, the duration wherein we see ourselves acting, and in which it is useful that we should see ourselves, is a duration whose elements are disassociated and juxtaposed. The duration wherein we act is a duration wherein our states melt into each other. It is within this that we should try to replace ourselves by thought. It might then be possible in a certain measure to transcend space without stepping out from extensity. A theory of matter. 1. Every movement, inasmuch as it is a passage from rest to rest, is absolutely indivisible. 2. There are real movements. 3. All division of matter into independent bodies with absolutely determined outlines is an artificial division. The essential character of space is continuity. That which usually hinders this mutual approach of motion and quality is the acquired habit of attaching movement to elements, atoms or whatnot, which interpose their solidity between the movement itself and the quality into which it contracts. As our daily experience shows us bodies in motion, it appears to us that there ought to be, in order to sustain the elementary movements to which qualities may be reduced, diminutive bodies or corpuscles. Motion becomes then for our imagination no more than an accident, a series of positions, a change of relations. Realism, so understood, is self-destructive. Indeed, we have no choice. If our belief in a more or less homogeneous substratum of sensible qualities has any ground, this can only be found in an act, which makes us seize or divine in quality itself, something which goes beyond sensation, as if this sensation itself were pregnant with details suspected yet unperceived. Its objectivity must then consist precisely in the immense multiplicity of the movements which it executes, so to speak, within itself as a chrysalis. Motionless on the surface, in its very depth, it lives and vibrates. As a matter of fact, no one represents to himself the relation between quantity and quality in any other way. To believe in realities distinct from that which is perceived is above all to recognize that the order of our perceptions depends on them and not on us. The duration lived by our consciousness is a duration with its own determined rhythm, a duration very different from the time of the physicist. Abstract space is, indeed, at bottom, nothing but the mental diagram of infinite divisibility, but with duration it is quite otherwise. The parts of our duration are one with the successive moments of the act which divides it. This imaginary homogeneous time is, as we have endeavored to show elsewhere, an idol of language, a fiction whose origin is easy to discover. In reality, there is no one rhythm of duration. It is possible to imagine many different rhythms which, slower or faster, measure the degree of tension or relaxation of different kinds of consciousness, and thereby fix their respective places in the scale of being. To conceive of durations of different tensions is perhaps both difficult and strange to our mind, because we have acquired the useful habit of substituting for the true duration lived by consciousness, homogeneous and independent time. Do we not sometimes perceive in ourselves, in sleep, two contemporaneous and distinct persons, one of whom sleeps a few minutes while the others dream, fills days and weeks? And would not the whole of history be contained in a very short time, for a consciousness at a higher degree of tension than our own? To perceive consists in condensing enormous periods of an infinitely diluted existence into a few more differentiated moments of an intenser life, and in thus summing up a very long history. To perceive means to immobilize. If there are actions that are really free, or at least partly indeterminate, they can only belong to beings able to fix at long intervals that becoming to which their own becoming clings, able to solidify it into distinct moments, and so to condense matter, and by assimilating it, to digest it into movements of reaction which will pass through the meshes of natural necessity, the greater or lesser tension of their duration, which expresses at bottom their greater or lesser intensity of life, the degree of the concentrating power of their perception, and the measure of their liberty. It is space that we thrust into extensity. Space is not a ground on which real motion is posited. Rather, it is real motion that deposits space beneath itself. Let us place ourselves face to face with immediate reality. At once we find that there is no impassable barrier, no essential difference, no real distinction even, between perception and the thing perceived, between quality and movement. The humblest function of spirit is to bind together the successive moments of the duration of things. As we have shown, pure perception, which is the lowest degree of mind without memory, is really part of matter as we understand matter. We may go further. Memory does not intervene as a function of which matter has no presentiment, and which it does not imitate in its own way. If matter does not remember the past, it is because it repeats the past unceasingly. Because subject to necessity, it unfolds a series of moments of which each is the equivalent of the preceding moment and may be deduced from it. Thus the past is truly given in its present. But a being which evolves more or less freely creates something new every moment. The past should be acted by matter, imagined by mind. The idea that we have disengaged from the facts and confirmed by reasoning is that our body is an instrument of action and of action only. In no degree, in no sense, under no aspect does it serve to prepare, far less to explain a representation. Consider external perception. There is only a difference of degree, not of kind, between so-called perceptive faculties of the brain and the reflex functions of the spinal cord. Consider memory. The body retains motor habits capable of acting the past over again. It can resume attitudes in which the past will insert itself, or again, by the repetition of certain cerebral phenomena, which have prolonged former perceptions, can furnish to remembrance a point of attachment with the actual, a means of recovering its lost influence upon present reality. But in no case can the brain store recollections or images. Do we turn to memory? We note that its primary function is to evoke all those past perceptions which are analogous to the present perception, to recall to us what preceded and followed them, and so to suggest to us that decision which is the most useful. But this is not all. By allowing us to grasp in a single intuition multiple moments of duration, it frees us from the movement of the flow of things, that is to say, from the rhythm of necessity. The more of these moments memory can contract into one, the firmer is the hold which it gives to us on matter. So the memory of a living being appears indeed to measure, above all, its power of action upon things, and to be only the intellectual reverberation of this power. My perception can only be some part of these objects themselves. It is in them rather than they in it. Perception consists in detaching from the totality of objects the possible action of my body upon them. Perception appears then as only a choice. It creates nothing. Its office, on the contrary, is to eliminate from the totality of images all those on which I can have no hold, and then from each of those which I retain, all that does not concern the needs of the image which I call my body. Such, at least, much simplified is the way we explain or describe schematically what we have called pure perception. The same needs, the same power of action which have delimited our body in matter will also carve out distinct bodies in the surrounding medium. Everything will happen as if we allowed to filter through us the action of external things which is real, in order to arrest and retain that which is virtual. This virtual action of things upon our body, and of our body upon things, is our perception itself. No doubt also the material universe itself, defined as the totality of images, is a kind of consciousness. But to touch the reality of spirit, we must place ourselves at the point where an individual consciousness, continuing and retaining the past, in the present enriched by it, thus escapes the law of necessity. Memory is something other than a function of the brain, and there is not merely a difference of degree but of kind between perception and recollection. The truth is that memory does not consist in a regression from the present to the past, but on the contrary, in a progression from the past to the present. It is in the past that we place ourselves at a stroke. We start from a virtual state, which we lead onwards step by step through a series of different planes of consciousness, up to the goal where it is materialized in an actual perception. That is to say, up to the point where it becomes a present, active state, up to that extreme plane of our consciousness against which our body stands out. In this spiritual state, pure memory consists. Our present should not be defined as that which is more intense. It is that which acts on us and which makes us act. Our past, on the contrary, is that which no longer acts, but which might act, and which will act, by inserting itself into a present sensation, from which it borrows the vitality. It is true that from the moment when the recollection actualizes itself, in this manner it ceases to be a recollection, and becomes once more a perception. With memory we are in the domain of spirit. Between the plane of action, the plane in which our body has condensed its past into motor habits, and the plane of pure memory where our mind retains in all its details the picture of our past life, we believe that we can discover thousands of different planes of consciousness, 1,000 integral and yet diverse repetitions of the whole of the experience through which we have lived. To complete a recollection by mere personal details does not at all consist in mechanically juxtaposing other recollections to this, but in transporting ourselves to a wider plane of consciousness, in going away from action in the direction of dream. The nascent generality of the idea consists in a certain activity of the mind in a movement between action and representation. Extensity is the most salient quality of perception. Between sensible qualities as regarded in our representation of them, and these same qualities treated as calculable changes, There is therefore only a difference in rhythm of duration, a difference of internal tension. Thus, by the idea of tension, we have striven to overcome the opposition between quality and quantity, by the idea of extension, that between the inextended and the extended. Absolute necessity would be represented by a perfect equivalence of the successive moments of duration. Spirit borrows from matter the perceptions on which it feeds and restores them to matter in the form of movements which it has stamped with its own freedom.